Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. John Hyland, a professor of ancient history at Christopher Newport University. In this episode, we discuss the real relationship between Sparta and Persia, dive into the motivations behind Persia funding the Spartans, who are not a naval power, and look a little at the logistics of war and the issues with moving armies and supplies. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Great. Thanks so much for joining me this morning, John. It's so good to see you again. And I want to start us off and just ask you, how did you get into the study of ancient Persia, Achaemenid studies specifically, but it had to start somewhere.
Oh, right. Lexie, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about ancient Persia with your program. I really started my interest in the ancient world when I was grade school age. And with Persia, really my first encounters were my dad reading me Herodotus as bedtime stories when I was in kindergarten or first grade. My dad is also a classical scholar, and he was studying for his Greek exams when I was in kindergarten, and would read me and translate passages. So I had a very early introduction that kind of came through the lens of the Greek world and the idea of the Persian-Greek wars. And then as I got older, and especially when I was high school aged, I read a lot of military history in many different periods of world history. And at that point, I was coming back and starting to read bits of Herodotus and bits of Xenophon in translation, and starting to get excited about trying to understand these ancient conflicts and how they worked. But what really sold me was when I was an undergrad in college. My freshman year in college at Cornell University, I took a class called Democracy and War with Barry Strauss. And it was a comparative history class looking at the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece and the Korean War and early Cold War era in 20th century. And I was hooked on this class. I loved everything about it, but it was really the ancient material that pulled me in more. And I found the more that I really dug into reading about the ancient Greeks, I wanted to know more about the Persians. The Persians were always there. It was always the big power in the background. And that really raised a curiosity to find out more about what was driving this major world power. So then it was a long story from there, but Barry convinced me to start taking Greek language and taking more ancient history classes with him. I wrote more papers, and more I find myself writing papers about what the Persians were thinking in the Greek history classes. And eventually that turned into a senior thesis. Then I was lucky enough to get to go to the University of Chicago and to study in their Committee on the Ancient Mediterranean World for my graduate studies. And that was an interdisciplinary program that allowed students to focus on Greek language and history alongside one or more languages from ancient Middle East or North Africa. And so in that context, I was able to really focus on the Persian Empire. I was able to study with a great Achaemenid historian, Matt Stolper, who's done an enormous amount of work on the Persepolis archives and the Babylonian documentation, and also to study Greek history at the same time. And so that really built on a more professional level that taught me how to be a scholar and how to think about cultural connections and interplay in the border zones between this huge Persian Empire and the Greek city-states.
That's really, really cool. I mean, props to your dad for also reading you Herodotus. That's a flex right there that I feel like many people just like that's its own level of cool. Because most people's like parents read them, I don't know, just like not that. So that's awesome.
I grew out of tradition. I started reading Herodotus to my kids during the COVID lockdown. It's a way of lightening the mood.
Sometimes you really do need to retreat into the past, into the ancient world, and it's amazing and rewarding. So props to you for introducing your kids, just continuing that nice tradition. But I'm a little curious. Were you always big into the warfare side? And did that come from anything like outside of, let's say, the interest in the ancient world? Do you have any connections to, did you have either family who served in the armed forces or something that like bolstered that? Or was it more like a, when kids get to a certain age and then you're like running around in school and you're like, I'm going to just play fight with friends and then get really interested. And then when you have access to the materials, you decide, you want to pursue it.
Yeah, I was always drawn to military history, again, from childhood. I, again, have stories from family about my grandparents fighting in the Second World War and a few stories about ancestors. There's not really much of a military tradition in my family. When I was getting into reading a lot of classical history as a teenager, I was also reading a lot on American Civil War, on Revolutionary era and Napoleonic warfare. And for a time, I thought that I was going to go into the military. And I had a very, very brief 2-month stint at the United States Military Academy to teach me that that was not my path. And I then went from there to Cornell, and I realized that I can study war and empire and government and society, but without having to actually go down that career path myself. But I think that those connections with it only increased the interest for me. And since moving to Virginia to teach at Christopher Newport University, again, this has only grown. I'm in an area with a really big military population. I live between naval base, army base, Coast Guard, and Air Force, and a lot of my kids' friends, parents are military. We've got lots of military contacts in the area. And so a lot of conversations I have in day-to-day life are with people who are connected to the military or to logistics or to shipping companies that ship things overseas. And again, all of this builds my interest in how this would work in a pre-modern context.
That's so fascinating. Now, you obviously came in through the Greek side. Many of us do, just because it's really easy to find some sort of classes on the ancient Greeks, and there's classics departments. But for people who are more interested in the Persian side, do you think it's possible? Like, is it easier now if you wanted to go straight to the Persians and kind of like bypass having to do classics to get to the Persians? I mean, it's probably changed a lot between when you were in school, when I was in school, and now. But I've just noticed that most of the people who eventually sort of phase into the Persians, they don't really get to start there.
I think there's greater opportunities now than there were. Again, it depends on very heavily on where you go to school, just the level of local interest and local availability of education on this. Obviously, the Iranian American community in California has been really interested in promoting education on ancient Iran that doesn't just fall back on Greek or Roman stereotypes. And my friend and colleague John Lee, I know, was involved in working with advocacy groups several years ago to try to increase the teaching of ancient Persia in California schools. We don't have as much. We certainly have an Iranian community in Virginia, especially Northern Virginia, and a smaller one in our area. But I think there's broader educational opportunities at the college level, just because there's a larger number of people practicing and teaching ancient Persian history to undergrads. There really weren't as many people outside a handful of elite colleges, I think, who were doing this in 1980s and 1990s. Whereas now, the opportunities have grown. That being said, I think there's a lot of value in studying the Persian Empire along with ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, and India, if possible. I think it's best situated in a broad world history teaching context to get as many potential avenues and comparisons as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that an interdisciplinary approach is very valuable. It's a good one because I've noticed that we don't generally do a very good job of educating people kind of like what's happening in different ancient cultures simultaneously to when things are happening. So when I was going through school, definitely in classics, I knew what was going on in the Greek world. And then I remember someone asked me, oh, hey, during the Peloponnesian War, what's happening in Egypt? Because you like Egypt. I was like, that's a bit of a random question, but okay, sure, fine. And then I realized I did not know the answer, and no one in my department really was going to teach us what was happening. So I think I ended up having to Google it, which, okay, fine. But then I was like, oh yeah, it's like chilling out as a Persian satrap. Cool, that's fun. That's just how I feel it goes these days. So a lot of your work has to do with, yes, ancient military, but I see you've done a ton of work on ancient Sparta, which in and of itself, right, it's a whole thing. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence left from Sparta itself, which is very, very sad. But Sparta is a place that has been heavily mythologized, and you do have the famous, for better or for worse, 300 film, which kind of highlights the relationship of Sparta and the Persians. But from a non-Hollywoodification point of view, can you elaborate a little bit on the relationship between Sparta and the Achaemenids? Because I'd like to think I know, but also I don't because no one taught me. And I feel like a lot of people would also be interested in what is the actual relationship between these places that's not just seen in 300.
Sure, I'm happy to. Again, this was kind of one of my entry points into the field when I was an undergraduate, was looking at Spartan and Persian diplomacy and thinking beyond the military confrontation that they're most famous for. So you have a large number of Greek city-states across the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea and the ancient Mediterranean. There were about 1,000 Greek city-states at the height of Greek culture around 400 to 300 BCE. Sparta was the largest Greek city-state in what's now mainland Greece in territorial terms, but was relatively underpopulated. And Athens, the other major Greek city-state that everybody learns about, also had a large territory, smaller than Sparta's, but it had a much higher population. Athens had a direct outlet to the sea through its harbor at the Piraeus, where Sparta is located inland, up a river valley that's not navigable. So Athens really developed with much broader contacts and trade with the outside world, especially in the late Archaic and Classical periods, so the 500s through the 300s BCE, where Sparta developed an effort at hegemony or basically coalition building with the Spartans on top among a large number of smaller Greek city-states in its immediate vicinity. The Spartans were not really an imperial power, though, and classical Athenian authors, especially Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, talk about Sparta's backwardness as a leader of other Greeks. The Spartans do not have a coined monetary system, in contrast with the Athenians and most Greek city-states by the 500s BCE. And over time, the Spartans falter as an imperial or hegemonic power because they are not very good at they're not really good at building a permanent trust among their allies. They're not particularly good at developing economic resources to finance their military campaigns and to be able to project power far away. So this creates this interesting dynamic when the Persian Empire sends military troops into the Greek mainland in the early 400s BCE. Um, in the year 480, the king of Persia, Xerxes, leads a military force that includes an army and a navy, but also the royal court. They have traveled all the way from Iran through what's now Turkey or Anatolia to get to the Aegean frontier, and then eventually by a winding path to try to attack the city of Athens. They're interested in punishing Athens for affronts that the Athenians have done against the Persian Empire, and Sparta gets pulled into it through alliance with the Athenians. The Spartans basically are trying to keep up their self-image as the leader among the Greek city-states. And they make a deal with the Athenians that they will ally with them, they will help protect them, they will lead a Greek coalition against Persia if they are allowed to be in charge, if the Athenians swear to follow orders from Spartan leaders on land and on sea. And the Athenians realize that most Greeks don't like them very much. The surrounding Greek city-states are fairly hostile towards the new Athenian democracy. They realize that if they want a deal, if they want enough manpower to resist a military attack from Persia, they need to play ball with Sparta. So they craft this very short-lived coalition, and they manage to not defend Athens at first. Athens is captured by Persians. It's burned twice by Persian forces in 480 and again in 479. But King Xerxes is not going to stay forever. Again, this is often depicted, certainly in Herodotus and Aeschylus and other classical authors, as a turn of the tide and a retreat where the Persian fleet loses the Battle of Salamis and then Xerxes goes home. But Xerxes was always going to go home. This is a royal progress from the middle of the empire to the edge, more than 2,000 miles from Persepolis. And he's always going to go back. This is the problem for any empire that's sending an invasion force into a very distant region in world history, that those who are resisting locally tend to have the advantage of time on their sides. So the Persian forces suffer some defeats in 479. Xerxes goes back home to Iran. But then over the next few years, the Spartan coalition with Athens unravels. Athens builds a navy and tries to make itself the hegemon of the Greeks in the Aegean. And the Spartans, lacking the same amount of ships and revenue, deeply resent Athens' rise to power. So over the following decades, what that leads to is an eventual Spartan interest in partnering with Persia. And this is the great irony of the 300 movies. They focus on this one very short moment in which Spartan troops fight in a way that ancient Greek authors were already mythologizing to try to slow down Persian forces going into Greece. But only decades later, Sparta is begging for a Persian alliance and for financing from the Persian Empire so they could have a chance of building a navy and fighting Athens. And that happens in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans are begging from the first year of the war. They're sending embassies to Persia saying, please give us money. And the Persians take several years before they're interested in this. But 2 decades into a 3-decade-long war, they finally come around to the idea that Sparta could be a useful client state. And the Persians give money. They allow the Spartans to build a fleet, which Athens sinks. Persia, you get the sense in the Greek sources that the Persian officials are pretty annoyed, but eventually agree to give more money. And eventually the Spartans manage to capture the Athenian navy. And in the long run, this leads through several more episodes on Spartan backsliding, some brief fighting between Spartans and Persians in the 390 BCE. But the eventual outcome is that Sparta agrees to a long-term deal with Persia. The Spartans agree that Persia is in charge of the Ionian Greek city-states in what's now the Asian part of Turkey. And the Persians give autonomy to all Greeks overseas. But they represent that autonomy, the freedom to choose one's own government, as a gift from the Persian king to the Spartans and the Athenians and to all the others. And Sparta and Athens ultimately both agree to this so-called King's Peace in 386 BCE, where Persia acts as an arbiter and treats all of the Greek cities as beneficiaries of Persian generosity.
Wow. I feel like in that nice, beautiful short history lesson, which I really appreciated because I really think I knew maybe an embarrassingly little amount of that. But you've also simultaneously just completely destroyed the 300 and the 300 sequel, because I did not know that Sparta had demanded to be in charge of both land and sea forces, because that runs so counter, right, to the idea that the Athenians were the dominant naval power in the region, in the area, in the age. And it's led to a lot of people believing that, like, Sparta just did not have a navy. Now, can you illuminate us a little bit as to, like, why do people think Sparta did not have a navy or any kind of naval prowess, which is why we're taught that, right, that we had to leave it to the Athenians? I mean, we talk about Salamis and we talk about the lionization of Athenians as being this amazing naval power, and look at what they did. But yeah, Spartans, navy, please help.
Sure. Sparta has a navy, but a very small one. From the city of Sparta itself. They have a port about 30 miles south of Sparta at Githio on the Peloponnesian coast. At the time of the Persian invasions, Sparta owns about 15 trireme warships, whereas Athens owns 200 that they've built right before the war. So Athens, with this naval surge right before Xerxes came, was the dominant naval power in terms of ships and available manpower for those ships. The Athenians also have an internal source of silver through the mines at Laurium, and that gives them the initial ability to finance shipbuilding and payments for the rowers who make the ships work. And over time, the Athenians augment that base of silver by charging a silver tribute to the other Greek city-states that they compel to stay in their Delian League alliance. Sparta has this very small number of ships, partly because it's not a port city, but partly because it lacks the silver access as well. The Spartans don't have that level of revenue that you would need to develop a larger naval power. So they don't build the infrastructure that goes along with supporting warships. Githium is a small port, but it doesn't have large numbers of dockyards, of what we call ship sheds, which are the onshore garages that you build to maintain triremes so they don't simply rot over a couple of years. Athens is already building ship sheds before Xerxes' invasion, and then constructs massive, very, very brilliantly designed harbors by the 460s BCE, in the generation after Xerxes came. And all that infrastructure makes it much more possible for Athens to wield a naval power. So the Spartans lead in 480 as part of their prestige as a city-state in Greece, but not for the number of ships that they can bring to bear. And that gives the Athenians leverage. Supposedly there are debates between the different Greek allies over whether or not it's safe to fight a naval battle against the Persians. And Herodotus shows the Athenian commander Themistocles saying that if you don't fight, if you desert us, we're going to sail away and found a colony in Italy, or maybe we'll join the Persians. Again, there are a few moments in Herodotus where the Athenians boast of their Greek patriotism and their desire to resist Persia forever, but then a few lines later threaten to join Xerxes. And again, that kind of pragmatism and the use of threats in alliance between cities that don't trust each other very much, that's part of what makes the dynamic of the ancient Greek world so fascinating to study. Over time, when Sparta does build a fleet in the Peloponnesian War, the number of actual Spartan ships remains very low. Again, we call it the Spartan fleet as a kind of shorthand, but it's still a coalition fleet with most of the ships coming from allied Greek cities that are also fighting against Athens. The biggest contributors would be Corinth in the northern Peloponnese and Thebes in central Greece, which is a long-term enemy of Athens and had actually fought for Persia during the Xerxes invasion. After the Peloponnesian War, I've written an article on this a couple of years ago. After the Peloponnesian War, Sparta has this enormous fleet because it's captured Athens' navy intact, but it doesn't have the infrastructure to actually maintain the ships. And it alienates its allies. It doesn't send any of the captured ships back to Corinth or Thebes. It tries to hoard them all itself, yet without the ability to fully support them. And then it quarrels with Persia, and the Persians cut off the funding. And within a few years, in the 390s, the Spartans briefly attempt to build their own empire along the east coast of the Aegean. And they say, we're going to liberate the Ionian Greek city-states. We're going to basically take over the Athenian Empire that ended at the end of the Peloponnesian War. They fail because Persia sends its navy into the Aegean Sea and destroys the Spartan fleet. And again, that seems to happen because the Spartan ships are old, they're deteriorating, they are poorly supplied and maybe undermanned. And when the Persians choose to deploy naval resources, they can easily sweep away this Peloponnesian fleet.
So to connect this back to Persia, so I think from what I remember and from what media, right, let's just put a blanket and say media on it, have shown us is that the Persians are a vast land power. They bring all their things over and they come and, they kind of bully the Greeks as they're trying to invade. I haven't seen something that really talks about their prowess as a naval power. They have a large navy just because it's a numbers game. And so they have so many people in a very, very large army, and they're going to build resources. So they can put their troops on a lot of ships and send them to Greece. And that's their navy. Great. But it's just interesting to me that you have Sparta, who eventually, right, a couple years later, whatever, they will go running to the Persians and say, hi, we need your help. Please fund us, yada, yada, yada. But was there any consideration on the Persian side, right, that it's like, well, they are known for being a land power. We're kind of a land power. Where is the benefit to us allying with the Spartans if, I don't know the status of their navy, but if they were not like the greatest naval power, it's interesting to me how they would take a few years and then be like, yeah, sure, let's ally with the one city-state that like has not a real great navy. That doesn't seem to benefit the Persians in any way. So, yeah, what was the state of the Persian navy then?
Sure, that's a great question, and again, it's complicated. I wrote a lot about this in my first book, and I could probably talk your ear off on it. But let me kind of focus on a couple of key details. So, first of all, the Persian navy is not necessarily a standing fleet that is always kept up to large numbers with combat-ready ships. They rely heavily on client kings or client governments in coastal Mediterranean city-states in order to provide the bulk of their warships. The Persian kings may subsidize ship building when they're getting ready for a big military campaign. They could facilitate the movement of shipbuilding resources between different regions. So when they control Egypt and the Levant, including the Phoenician city-states, they are able to basically support shipbuilding in both areas, which would involve some movement and trade of material between them. So Egypt does not have good shipbuilding timber. And you get that from the mountains in Lebanon through the territories of Sidon and Tyre. The Phoenicians are going to rely on Egypt for papyrus, which you can use in sail making. You can get materials for hemp rope from Egypt. That's essential for the rigging of warships. And what the Persian kings can do is basically speed up that process of drawing on the resources from different regions. This probably happens before Xerxes builds the huge fleet that he takes into the Aegean in 480. So Xerxes' fleet in 480 certainly is not as big as Herodotus and Aeschylus claim that it was. In my book that I'm currently working on, I follow a lot of scholars who accept a middle of the road figure, 600 warships or so rather than 1,200, which the ancient authors claim. But even 600, for logistical reasons, is really enormous when you imagine crews of about 200 people on each of these warships. So it's incredibly expensive to maintain them, just in terms of the sheer food resources, to say nothing of the silver that you probably want to give your rowers to keep them working on your ships. That means that these fleets are built for a major expedition, but in the wake of it, even if the Persians had won in 480, even if they beat the Greek fleet at Salamis and they established pro-Persian client governments in parts of Greece, I don't think they would have kept up that fleet. Again, I think it wouldn't have suffered the same level of battle damage. You probably would have had smaller numbers of ships concentrated back in Mediterranean harbors and then maybe replaced after a decade or two. But there wasn't a rationale for a fleet on that level, except for a very short-term royal power display. Xerxes is going. He wants to show off that he rules both the seas as well as the entire earth. He wants to exceed his father, Darius the Great's achievements. And the best way to do that in a naval frontier area is to gather as many ships as you can. But afterwards, those ships, in fact, are decimated in the fighting against the Greeks. And we don't see an effort to rebuild anything on that scale ever again. You get smaller Persian fleets that show up from time to time in Greek historians in the Peloponnesian War era, and especially in the 300s BCE, because Egypt seceded from the Persian Empire in 404, and the Persians launched several expeditions with land and sea forces to try to take it back. So at the time that they're starting to deal with the Spartans, what we see is the Persians maybe have a handful of warships in the Phoenician city-states. They can build a larger number, but they also spot an opportunity to end Athenian power and set up patronage over a new hegemon in the Greek world. And that actually comes in response to events in the Peloponnesian War. In the year 413, Athens had famously miscalculated by trying to invade Sicily in the Western Mediterranean. It had sent ultimately 2/3 of its navy, more than 500 miles from home, gambling on the ability to expand the Athenian Empire. And instead, they lost them all. And at that moment, Thucydides writes that in the winter of 413 to 412, the news of Athens' naval disaster comes back to the Aegean Sea, and that reaches the Persians as well as Sparta and other Aegean Greeks. Thucydides writes that everyone in Ionia, and that probably can extend to the Persians a few miles inland at Sardis, that everyone in Ionia thought the war would end within months, that Athens is about to surrender, its navy has been destroyed, so the Greeks that it's taxing are going to rise up and break away from Athens. It's basically over. That's the moment when Persian regional governors in Western Turkey send messages to Sparta and offer funding. And what seems to be happening is this rush. The Persians recognize the situation in the Aegean is changing. Athens appears to have lost its navy. So they offer to speed up the process, give some short-term funds. Sparta can gather and pay a fleet and finish Athens off. And then it will owe the Persian Empire for its generosity. And instead, they end up in this awkward situation because Athens doesn't surrender and the war drags on for 8 more years. It ends up being successful, but it ends up being a very expensive commitment, which I don't think the Persians expected when they get entangled in it.
Okay, it's very helpful because that's connecting the dots. So it was more just, yeah, it's expensive. We don't want to. Oh, but hey, there might be a chance. So okay, we'll ally with you, but LOL, that really failed. So okay, and it's interesting because for an empire as large as the one the Achaemenids built, it seems like it was a whole dynasty built on not a lot of massive miscalculations on the sort of military side. From what you've studied and observed, is this kind of the biggest one of the biggest ones that they make, or in the grand scheme of the Achaemenid dynasty, is this like an actual shorter blip, let's say, on the radar?
Sure. I think every historical empire goes through periods of expansion and then consolidation and stabilizing. And every historical empire experiences its share of military defeats as they try to establish exactly how far their influence and power projection can spread. And you can find a litany of Roman military disasters that accompany the formulation of the Roman Empire during the Republic and the stabilizing in the Principate. You can find a litany of British military disasters in not only the American Revolution, but Britain's colonial wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. And again, I think this is something that goes along with the quality of empire building. I think the natural tendencies towards exploitation and violence and seeing how far you can push your power go hand in hand with territorial expansion and conquest. And there are going to be a number of missteps and setbacks which can be blamed on a bad general. It can be blamed, I think, the Persians as well as the Romans can blame these military defeats maybe on a temporary loss of divine favor for a commander who in some way angered the gods, but can be distanced from the actual government. This is something that I'm arguing in my current book, a chapter I've just finished writing, on a Persian general named Mardonius. He becomes Xerxes' proxy commander once Xerxes himself leaves mainland Greece and begins to move back into the empire. He leaves behind military forces in Greece. Mardonius is left behind, and Herodotus makes one of his characters mention that this is the ideal solution. If Mardonius wins, Xerxes gets the credit for defeating the Greeks, and if he loses, he's a bad apple, and it's all his fault. And again, I think that kind of goes hand in hand. We can see this in the Roman Empire with the disaster of Varus in Germany. And again, 3 Roman legions get massacred in Germany. All of a sudden, it's not the emperor's fault. We don't know this guy. He's not representative of Augustus and Tiberius. Imperial powers know how to expand. They engage in bloody frontier wars from time to time. They experience casualties along the way, but they know how to insulate themselves from mistakes. And the Persians are pretty flexible and adaptable in figuring out new approaches to a frontier when something goes wrong. That's one of the things I found most interesting in writing my current book project, which is a prequel to my first book. My first book looked at the diplomacy between Persia and Athens and Sparta after Xerxes' invasion. But my second book is going back to the big invasion itself, looking at Persia's Greek military campaigns and trying to understand a tension between the image of royal power in a symbolic sense, a world rule, and the realities of how you feed so many people and move so many people. And it's often in those tensions between power aspirations and real logistics and real issues of military tactics that sometimes people blunder and the empire loses 2 important battles at Salamis and Plataea. But the Greek military defeats for Persia are not in any sense an ending or even a serious weakening of Achaemenid imperial power. Xerxes himself goes back to the center of his empire and reigns for 13 more years. And He may be engaged in military campaigns on other fronts. There's some evidence for his new construction projects, not just at Persepolis, but also in the Caucasus on the northern frontier. There's imagery of victories over Saka or other nomadic groups from Central Asia that seems pretty prevalent during Xerxes' reign and the following generations. So there's probably more going on and a bigger picture than just Greece. Again, Xerxes waged a first campaign. Greece is his second campaign. And the first campaign, he put down a revolt in Egypt by a would-be pharaoh. And that seems completely successful. He put down a Babylonian revolt, maybe while coming back from the Egyptian expedition. So again, I think there's enough from the imperial perspective for him to be able to present himself as a victorious ruler, a successful ruler, even if that means downplaying or ignoring some things that are going wrong on one particular frontier. So after his expedition, there are some really bad consequences for Persian garrison outposts in the northern Aegean. And again, some forts get taken by the Athenians and Persians are killed or captured. The Athenian navy starts to become a greater and greater problem. By about 450 BCE, though, Xerxes' son Artaxerxes sees the value in ending conflict with Athens. And they make a peace that might have been informal or possibly a formal treaty. But in either case, it basically allows them to resume trade and for the Persians to accept Athenian embassies and gifts and to kind of render Athens as a client state. So in the end, I think we have a shift from war to diplomacy over time that allows the Persians to project power when more of a hard power approach didn't work.
No, I mean, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, especially when you've so beautifully explained it in a way that is hopefully very easy for anyone who's not an expert in this at all to understand. Because, yeah, it is a very, very large superpower. And so, yeah, something like the Greek campaign kind of on the periphery. I don't think sitting here from what I know, I don't think I would sit here and be like, oh yes, that was, and it was so devastating and that they will never recover. And it would just, so yeah, it's interesting to think about though. And it opens up a whole new, well, I don't know if it's a whole new, for me at least. It does open up a lot of different dimensions in which I'm able to think about the Persian Empire at that time, its size, it's a bit incredible, right? Coming from classics where you study a place that is kind of relatively small and then they're always having war and arguments and it's never one united Greek Empire, right? So it does shape kind of how you interpret and look at what's happening in the ancient world. So then to look at this major sort of superpower over here, yeah, it's really interesting and it's really different. So I love all of that. Now, there's so much more that I could get into, but we would be here until we're like 100 years old, and I wish I could do that. But I am going to just kind of skip over some things and go right to asking you. We've talked about this legacy of Persian imperial power and warfare and things. So what we have, though, is we're left with two sort of very different views of the Persians and their conflict with the Greeks. You have what media tells us through 300 and other things, and then we have what the history books say. So if we were to like change this and, input some sort of more Persian friendly, respectful, and accurate core curriculum, pedagogy, something in a way where we don't end up with two very different skewed opinions. Having studied both, do you think there's a way where we can make stuff that's a little more accurate and Persian friendly? Because I don't really want to have to always refer to 300. I'm tired of telling people, oh yeah, you want to learn about the Persians? Watch 300. I'm tired of doing that.
Right, sure. And again, we would definitely not want people to take their Persian history from that. I think there is. I think that there's a lot that can be done to, first of all, there's so much visual material from the Persian Empire. And one thing that I do when I'm teaching my students at Christopher Newport University, I have a Persian history seminar that has mostly history majors and some classics or Middle East studies students. But many of the students come into the class with no prior experience studying ancient Persia. And I find the visuals are incredibly important for drawing them in and generating questions about the worldview, the culture, the arts in this cosmopolitan empire. And what does it mean to be an empire that draws on cultural traditions from Greece, from Egypt, from Babylonia, from India, as well as the ancient Iranian world? What does it mean to interact with Phoenicians, with Judeans and other people in the Levant? What does it mean to interact with Saka and nomad people on the northern frontiers? So one of the really important things that I think is worth stressing in education is the pluralism. Again, it's become something of a cliche, but I think a justified cliche, that Persia is the first world empire and that it is farther reaching, it is more diverse, it is more of a link and a connection between dozens of well-known ancient cultures than the smaller imperial formations that had come before in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. It draws on so many other traditions, and I think it can be used, again, just when I'm talking to my grade school aged kids, I think it can be used to interest them as sort of a culminating moment where we get, what happens if we want Egyptians and Babylonians and Judeans and Greeks to all meet one another. So that's part of it, is the approach on the pluralism, looking at the art for ideas of how material from different cultures can come into contact with each other and what are the results. I think all of that is a really useful way to approach the subject and raise people's interests. Again, I think the visuals also give us the chance to look at images of Persepolis, the other Persian monuments at Naqsh-e-Rustam, the painted frieze reliefs from Susa, and so many more. There's so many images that are really visually arresting. And when students look at these images, they're going to have a response to them. I usually start my class discussions by putting up something like the Bisatun relief and just asking the students, tell me what you see. What's going on in this picture? What could this mean? And I think using those materials is a great way of drawing out an interest in a more complex but a more interesting story of the ancient world.
No, I mean, I think that's really valuable because from what I remember when I was an undergrad, we had a lot of Greek and Roman art and archaeology courses, which were very visual. We had one course on Egyptian and Near Eastern art and archaeology, but this course was only taught once every 4 semesters. So a very long time could go between, and we had nothing for Persia, and we had nothing visual. And, the closest we could get was, I think there was a class on Byzantine or Islamic art. And I picked up a minor in art history and archaeology, and I found it really wonderful and interesting. And there's so many wonderful pieces of ancient art that are so visually arresting that if you are not exposed to, you then are kind of, out of luck, which really sucks. So I do agree that, I think putting more Persian art and have it be accessible to more students would be a really good idea, because that does, like most things, it does spark interest if you read about it or if you see it. But especially if you see something, I feel like people are more likely to go, oh, actually, that runs counter to everything I've seen, so maybe I'll learn more about it. So I hope that more people will start putting more Persian art into courses, or just have it displayed somewhere, honestly, and hope it sparks a conversation. I did want to quickly ask about the book. I know you are working on a new book. Now, I hate doing this now. I'm very aware that it is probably going to be not very easy for you, but a lot of people are very interested in ancient Persia and the ancient world. but they don't always have the time to sort of sift through, read all these abstracts, especially if it's like a more academic book in tone, let's say, which are written quite differently from trade books and sort of easier things to parse through. So in talking about the new book, can you maybe give us a clue as to, what is the main takeaways that you would like people to come away with?
Thank you. So the name of the book is Persia's Greek Campaigns, Kingship, Spectacle, and Warfare on the Achaemenid Frontier. So the idea of the book is trying to put the invasions of Greece by Xerxes and earlier by Darius's generals into a broad ancient Middle Eastern context. We don't have Persian accounts of the invasions of Greece, but we have a lot of Persian documents for how the invasions would have worked in terms of supply systems and communications, how movement over the imperial road system works. And so we can take the Persian framework, and then we can also look at royal chronicles from the predecessors of the Persian Empire, who often framed their power, their worldview, and their reasons for military campaigns in really similar ways. So these are especially royal annals from the Assyrian Empire in the 700s and 600s BCE, and a series of shorter chronicles on Babylonian military campaigns in the 500s BCE, right before the Persian Empire takes them over. What I'm doing in writing this new book is basically thinking about how the worldview of a king and the desire to associate a king with military power display, how did that interact with the realities of moving and feeding and organizing soldiers and sailors? And so there are several chapters that look at the background and what are some of the kinds of spectacles that a king would engage in when he went on campaign. A royal campaign is not just a normal military operation. It's like a rolling press conference that travels for hundreds or even, in Xerxes' case, more than 2,000 miles. Throughout this, Xerxes' journey from Iran to Greece and back takes 3 years, round trip. It's not simply trying to capture military objectives. There are all sorts of parades and ceremonies and public displays of the king's military might on the way. And the king's appearance is being very carefully staged. So we see that in Assyrian and Babylonian texts, and then we see lots of descriptions in Herodotus that look very similar. Except Herodotus always has something snarky to say at the end. Herodotus is always looking to undercut the royal spectacle, to use hindsight. We know what happened after that. The gods weren't really on their side. He'll report the negative omens that the Persians overlooked or misread, and he'll portray the entire spectacle as hubris, where from the Persian and wider ancient Middle Eastern perspective, this is part of a very lengthy tradition of royal display. So the book is basically about that. It's looking at how it differs when the king is on the campaign as opposed to smaller, less ambitious operations when the king is not present. And it kind of traces, as far as we can, some of the logistics of how food supply would work. It looks at evidence for ships and for weaponry to try to understand and explain what might have gone wrong in the naval battles at Salamis and Plataea. But ultimately, it argues that the logistics of the campaign were well managed, that the Persians were very, very good at moving large numbers over great distances. And what ends up going wrong in the Greek military campaign is not so much imperial overextension as some bad tactical decisions on 2 days at Athens and in Boeotia in central Greece. The Persians very well could have won these military encounters, and I don't think that they're incapable of competing with their smaller Greek neighbors. But when the king has this giant rolling spectacle of power and he goes there in person and spends 3 years of a 20-year reign traveling there and back, and then there are defeats while he's there, it's embarrassing. And again, some of the later chapters of the book are also thinking about how the royal image would be managed and how would he try to insulate himself from defeat, for example, by scapegoating commanders who get the blame and who also die in the expedition and don't come home to contest the royal version.
It's fascinating to hear about the logistics of war and kind of everything that goes into it and how you get a king to come. And because we hear a lot of, and the army moved from here to there. And there's no kind of thought really, unless I guess you really have a logistical mind. But for the most part, when I talk to people, we definitely say, yes, and they moved from here to here. Even when we talk about something like Alexander's campaigns, you hear just a lot of, oh, yes, and they went from here to there and there. And it seems like a fluid sort of movement where they just were able to pick up and go somewhere and then put down, conquer a place and move on. So I think that it would be quite enjoyable to really look sort of behind the curtain, let's say, of what does it actually mean when you have to take an army, right? Or feed your army. So yeah, ancient supply chains, like these are very practical concerns. And it's funny, right? Because I don't know if you find, but I find that the more knowledgeable people get and sort of the higher you go in academic reading classes, whatever you find, it's like the simplest questions that tend to drop off the map. You want to get into all these erudite things of, okay, so what's the most elegant, big problem I can think of? And it's kids, right? It's either kids or people who don't study the stuff, who answer like who ask the important questions, like how did large armies go to the bathroom? How did they feed people? How did they, it's fascinating. So I feel like in describing the next book that is not due for release for a couple years, so we will have to wait if we want these big questions answered, I suppose. But it's interesting to hear that you are working on it. Because I would like to know. I would very much like to know. How did large armies actually have to transport their people and their food and feeding all these people? And it's not easy.
Sure. Thanks so much. Again, logistics are really important, obviously, for military operations. And the study of ancient military logistics really started in some ways with a book by Donald Engels on the logistics of Alexander the Great's army, but then has really built up in Roman military studies, where there's vast amounts of supporting evidence. And so I've been drawing a lot on these comparative studies, especially more recent Roman logistics work. But also there's work on the Assyrian army, and the Persepolis fortification tablets provide a huge amount of information inside the empire for how small and large groups are being fed as they're moving across huge spaces. So that was really key to talking about logistics in this book. Again, one of the biggest takeaways from the research there was the earlier studies of Xerxes logistics, such as there's an article by Kyler Young that came out in 1980, and they were basically influenced by Engels. They were focusing on how the Persians could get access to grain, and basically, how much grain flour could the Persians transport, and how would that work over this distance. One of the things that you see in the Persepolis tablets is that work parties and travel parties and soldiers are all getting daily rations in flour, usually barley flour, but also, or alternatively, in meat. And they can be issued basically lamb or goat or mutton. They can bring animals with them on the hoof or pick up herds at various spots. And it's not just a grain ration. Again, there's probably also some degree of supplementing from local markets with pulses and vegetables and things to add to that basic soldier's ration. But thinking about this, especially just about Persian soldiers as meat eaters, the fact that you also see sheep routinely involved in the rations in this imperial work system, it actually kind of opens up thinking how flexible logistics could be in mainland Greece. That there are a lot more options in moving into a region like Attica around Athens, where the harvests hadn't been planted for the invasion year. There are more opportunities for acquiring food in various other ways to supplement what they have. And I think the Persians were exceptional at logistics, at mass feeding as well as mass movement. So one other plug, the other book that I'm co-editing right now is a Brill volume. It's Brill's Companion to War in the Ancient Iranian Empires. And that includes chapters by specialists from the ancient Elamite period through the Achaemenids and all the way through the Sasanian Empire. Co-editing this with the Sasanian scholar Khodadad Rezakhani. And there are a number of chapters in this collection that address army organization. My chapter looks at the Achaemenid army and its organization and at a short version of logistics. And that should hopefully be coming out next year. So if you want the shorter, more digestible version, that'll be out before the larger book.
Great. Well, I mean, we will definitely make sure that when they do come out, we will come back and we will link them in the show notes of this episode. And hopefully we can even re-release this episode just to remind people, hey, if you're interested. So we definitely will want to put all that info for people to find because we want to make these materials findable. So before we wrap up here, I do want to just mention that I think it's fascinating studying ancient warfare, and especially ancient warfare from a bit of a different perspective, because I think it's a bit more common that if someone says, oh, well, I'm a military historian, I feel like people are maybe 90% of the time going to be asked, okay, so does that mean you do ancient Rome, or do you do Alexander, or something more contemporary, maybe Greece? So for students who may want to follow in your footsteps and say, I'm really interested in Persia too, and I really like military history, I like learning about battles and all these things that have to do with ancient warfare. If you were going to give them advice about how best now to sort of get into the field, what would it be?
Sure. Well, I'd say to study the Persian Empire, first thing is you need access to a number of different ancient languages. And try to, get some familiarity with history classes or with art history classes that deal with aspects of ancient Persia and start to kind of build up your reading and your general knowledge. But if you want to pursue the field, you should be looking at some languages to begin your ability to access the ancient sources directly. And ideally, you should be looking at interdisciplinary graduate school programs that provide the opportunity to look at different cultures in contact. Again, because studying ancient Persia doesn't just mean the study of Fars or of Iran as a territorial or a political unit. It's much broader than that. You need a number of ancient languages as well as familiarity with a number of modern languages. When I started out in college, I did Greek and Latin as well as German as my modern language, and I learned French as I came into grad school. But there are so many ancient languages that are out there that are important for the Persian Empire. The ones that I would really encourage people to study if they ever got an opportunity would include Old Persian, Babylonian/Akkadian. If you have the chance to study Elamite or Egyptian hieroglyphics or Demotic or Biblical Hebrew and or Aramaic, all of those can be gateway languages that can lead you into broader study of the Persian Empire. But the other great thing about this field is that no one can learn all of the languages. There's not enough time, there's not enough funding. I guess if one were a hermit and independently wealthy, you could just study every Achaemenid language. But this field is collaborative. By the very size and shape of the Persian Empire, it depends on people who have a few ancient languages and a few relevant modern languages, and then can bring them to bear and talk to other people who work on other parts of the puzzle. And ideally, the more you learn over time, you pick up what you can wherever you can along the way.
And in your opinion, to study ancient warfare, does one need to do a lot of field work and look at material culture, or could you get by looking mostly through the texts and be sort of on the more philological side. And I ask this because obviously travel to Iran is not a thing right now if you're, well, American or a lot of other things. So people see lack of travel access as a barrier. So I'm just wondering, if I were to say, yes, I want to study ancient warfare, can I get away with the texts, basically?
Right. Well, I would answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, in terms of travel to sites that are connected with the Persian Empire, I've never been to Iran. I hope that someday circumstances will change and that will become more possible for American scholars, my generation and younger. The areas of the Persian Empire that I've visited are all in Western Turkey and in Greece, but there are lots of places that one can potentially look at parts of the former Persian Empire, especially whether that is Egypt and the Levant or whether that's the Turkey and the Aegean. There are a number of places that are very accessible. For studying ancient military history, I would say first and foremost, you need a grounding in the texts. You need to study the ancient languages in part because interpretations of what happened in a particular battle can come down to a single verb. They can really hinge very much on how people read a single sentence or a passage. And again, writing an early book review that inspired me to write the full-length book on the Persian Greek Wars, one of the things that stood out for me was looking at different books on the Battle of Marathon and how differently they interpreted the battle based on their reading of one or two key sentences in Herodotus. There was one book that commented on the Persians almost breaking through the Greek lines, but not being strong enough to do so. Yet if you look at Herodotus, the Greek explicitly says that they were breaking through and they were pursuing into the hinterland before the Athenian counterattack turned the tide. And so that leaves you with a very different interpretation. Are Persian soldiers not well equipped enough to be able to hack it against Greek hoplites? Or are they relatively equal in combat ability, but due to certain circumstances, they lost this particular action? And so you have to start, if you're looking at battles, you have to start with the text and be able to read it and look at the commentaries and the different translations very closely. You have to learn to be humble and to not read too much into a text too. And that's something that I'm always afraid of being guilty of. It's always a danger when we have so few pieces of evidence, often no real primary source texts, and we're trying to reconstruct an event that happened 2,500 years ago. There's so much that we don't know. We have to be sensitive to the limits of the evidence, but also then develop a kind of confidence and boldness that you're willing to say something new and to realize how that's grounded in the evidence that we do have. But going beyond that, the texts aren't enough. They're essential, but they're not enough. You have to be able to look at the landscape and everything we know about the landscape. You have to be able to look at archaeological reports if they're available, whatever evidence you can possibly get in on the actual physical setting of military movement and fighting. And above all, you need to be able to look at images, ancient iconography, and every ancient remnant of arms and armor and military equipment. There's lots of good comparative scholarship then that you might want to bring to bear on things like archery range and the weight of spears and the ways that they were held. All of these have to be put together in some coherent way to have a chance to try to explain how fighting would have worked. Again, that being said, none of us are going to know exactly what a battle was like 2,500 years ago. Those of us without combat experience, without those of us fortunate enough to not have physically lived through war, are not really going to understand just the human emotion of being in a situation of war or mass trauma. So, again, we've got to look at scholarship and be very careful not to just project assumptions without a strong base and a strong comparative context.
That's fantastic. It all sounds good to me. I clearly will not be going into military history anytime soon, but I hope that there are plenty of young scholars who will take your advice to heart and figure out ways to go and do great things and discover more things and help advance the field. So there are two final questions that I would like to ask you and that I hope will get our audience thinking. And the first one is, in your opinion, what is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Ancient Persia provides the framework for world empire, for the combination of military force and organizational ability and economic acquisition with the ability to make it beneficial for social elites in many different regions and many different cultural contexts. This had already been done by the local Mesopotamian empires going back to the Akkadians in the late 3rd millennium BCE. This had already been done by New Kingdom Egypt. This is done by a number of other regional powers. But Persia is the first to apply this at an intercontinental scale. Again, from Pakistan to the edges of Sudan and Libya and Greece. To be able to do this on this scale requires mass communication. It requires mass persuasion techniques. And above all, it requires the ability to give incentives for local elites to cooperate with a central power. Other empires build on this. And I teach a world history class to non-history majors at CNU that's part of our core curriculum of Gen Eds, and it emphasizes the toolkit of empire. This really starts with the Achaemenids, and then through the Hellenistic world, this passes on to the Romans. We see aspects of this in the early Islamic empires. We see aspects of this moving through the Sasanian world into Central Asia, and it probably has some long distance impact on regional empire building in India and in some of the Central Asian regions that eventually come into contact with China, with the Xiongnu, the medieval Chinese empires, and later the Mongol state. All of these empires build massive road networks or enhance the road networks that exist. They maximize communication speed and messengers. They find out how to make empire work for the powers that be who agree to cooperate with them among the local populations. They are also all, by nature of being imperial formations, they're all engaged in bloody exploitative expansion. I don't want to give the impression that some empires are kinder and gentler than others. There's hard power and soft power, but imperial formations, whether that's Persia or Rome or Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire or Britain in the modern period, they are all willing to engage in mass violence and to make examples of people who don't cooperate with the imperial ideal. But all of them have the staying power that they do for as long as they do, because they're also good at pragmatic accommodation. And again, I think that's the lesson that Persia gives to later empires. For better or for worse, it becomes crucial in the shaping of subsequent world history.
Wow, what trendsetters, for better and for worse, but definitely trendsetters. So the second question I wanted to leave you and the audience with is, in your opinion, what would be the best legacy that we ourselves can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
That's a wonderful question. I think the importance of investigating all of the different types of evidence and of broadening our views of the ancient world, trying to go beyond older paradigms and older stories to get at the larger implications and how different regions of the world connected with one another. So studying Persian history, again, I began in childhood coming to the ancient Persians through the lens of the ancient Greeks and coming at them through fairly narrow views of military encounter. But again, I think what we can learn from studying ancient Persia is the importance of going beyond simplified stereotypes, going beyond ideas of East versus West conflict, which was really popular when I was in grad school around the time of September 11th and the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trying to move beyond these kinds of simplistic narratives to understand all of the broader interconnections of cultural exchange. Again, looking at ancient Persia is valuable in its own right for the cultural legacy that Persia and Iran bring to world history, and in terms of the arts, in terms of architecture, in terms of the great poetic legacy that comes after the Achaemenid period but becomes a crucial part of Iranian world culture. All of these are important gifts to world history and literature and culture and deserve further study. But again, what fascinates me most and what kind of drives my research is that idea about frontier zones and border zones and cultural interaction, which can include war, but also interaction in diplomacy, in economics, in art and religion and literature. And basically, I think that the more questions we can generate about the border dynamics at the edge of empires, the richer our understanding of world history is going to be.
That's fantastic. And I mean, this has been such a wonderful conversation. It's got me thinking so much, so much about legacy, so much about perception, especially to do with kings and warfare and conquest. And one of the parting thoughts I want to leave with the audience and with you, I suppose, if you'll allow me to be a little playful, is when you were talking about the impact of the Greek campaign on Xerxes and how it was basically at its core like a small ripple to a very large empire, and it didn't really do much. For whatever reason, my brain just kind of thought to myself, oh, you're right, he could turn it on its head, he could do whatever he needed to make it look like he was still a good king. He went home because he had to leave, and then he was fine. And this is so opposite of, now I'm not a historian in this time period, I'm just an enthusiast and I watch a lot of things with this history period, but the famous sort of Scottish English war between Henry VIII and his cousin James V, King of Scotland, when Henry's forces defeated James at the Battle of Solway Moss, the king famously, now I'm sure it's been changed because history is written by the victors, but hearing that James essentially retreated, went home, there was no way to talk about how this was just a small little incident. He went home and then 2 days later took to his bed and died, which is then why we have Mary Queen of Scots left in this horrible position of being shipped away because she's the only girl. So these are two very different instances, though, of defeats, but we don't remember James V as a good, great king. His battle defeat was horrific, and now we make fun of him for being that guy who ran away to Scotland and died. And Xerxes is kind of untouched really by it. I mean, in Greece, obviously, they talk about it as, it's a very big turning point in Greek history, and they sort of lionize it. But of course, as a scholar of ancient Greek history, that's just kind of what they do. And we talk about how great Greece is a lot, so that makes sense. But it was just very interesting how our conversation sparked this idea of, can you turn defeat into nothing? Can we just ignore it? Do you become sort of a laughingstock in history? And it's very telling, and it's very interesting that we don't really spend a lot of time outside of the field talking about the example and kind of what a brilliant job that the Persians did. But in this example that my brain thought up, I was like, wow, he did good job, Xerxes. You were not a laughingstock. Also, it helps that he didn't die 2 days after getting home, but the point remains the same. And so that's just what I was thinking about, and I kind of love it a lot, and it's going to stick with me, and I'm still going to think about it going forward. But all that aside, thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure, and just to be able to talk a little bit about a topic that I myself wanted to learn a lot more about and that I feel needs more airtime.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on the program, and I've been so lucky to be able to attend some events at the Port Food Center and see some of their online videos. And it's fantastic to see the attention that they're bringing to ancient Persian studies and raising the profile of ancient Persian studies in the U.S. So I'm really happy to be able to be a small part of that.
Wonderful. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to send you an email about either taking a class or just a question generally about ancient warfare, or check out some of your work?
Sure. Well, you can find my email address is john.hyland@cnu.edu. I'm a professor at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, and you can find my faculty profile page there. I also have a profile on academia.edu where I posted a number of my articles and shorter works of scholarship. And you can find my first book, which is called Persian Interventions, the Achaemenid Empire, Athens and Sparta from 450 to 386 BCE. You can find that from Johns Hopkins University Press on any number of online booksellers, as well as the Johns Hopkins Press website.
Wonderful. Well, I will link all of those things in the show notes so they can find that as well. And sir, thanks again for doing this.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Port Food podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexie Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Port Food Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Port Food Institute and at Port Food UCLA, or visit our website portfood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Port Food Institute, please email us at portfoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.